I think a lot of authors think of voice as something external that we have to try to find or put on in our work or just impose upon it, I guess. And I don't think that's what it is. I think voice is when you are accessing whatever's true to you internally and letting that come out, which is a lot scarier.
Hello, fellow creative voyagers. This week on the Indie Author Podcast, I talk with Tiffany Yates Martin about tapping into your author voice, including how many writers mistakenly view voice as an external element that they need to find or impose on their work. Instead, she believes that true voice comes from genuinely accessing and expressing one's internal truths, a process that can feel quite daunting at times. Tiffany emphasizes that an authentic voice is not about adopting a facade, but rather about tapping into what is true to the author and allowing it to emerge naturally in their writing. And now, let's hear from Tiffany Yates Martin about tapping into your author voice. Hello, and welcome to the Indie Author Podcast. Today, my guest is Tiffany Yates Martin. Hey, Tiffany, how are you doing?
Hey, Matty. Good. How are you?
I am great. And at this point, normally I would say to give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you, but you have been on the podcast so many times that I think people probably know you now. So you have been on talking about creating character motivation, the fallacy of magical knowing. We also talked about the 3 stages of story, being the captain of your author voyage, which I love, not a metaphor, how to get and receive critique, X-raying your plot. That was way back in episode 65. That's really in the way back machine, and what authors can learn from TV and movies. So if any of those sound interesting to anyone, they should go to theindieauthor.com/podcast and search for Tiffany, and you'll be able to find all those. But I thought in lieu of the formal intro, I am now asking repeat guests to share some fact about yourself that we might not otherwise find out about.
Yeah. This is a tough one. I always feel like I haven't climbed Mount Kilimanjaro or anything like that. I guess one of the things that, because I do a lot of online teaching, I do a lot of writing, people mostly know me through that. And then when they meet me, they're always surprised because I'm 6 feet tall. Yeah. So probably it's that. Unless you've met me in person, that always seems to be a surprise to people.
You're going to be surprised by your height. Also, you have your camera sort of angled down. So like when people are looking up at you, then they'll be surprised at the difference in perspective.
That's funny.
As a shorter person, I have the camera more angled up. So, they'll be surprised.
I have no idea where to put the damn thing, quite frankly. Like my husband gave me this very nice camera and I love it, but it mounts on the top of the monitor. So I know that the angle is weird, but I don't know where to put it.
It's very professional looking. Yeah, I like your whole setup. So don't make any changes to it. And then you'll be able to retain the surprising people with your height when you meet them in person.
It's an optical illusion.
So we had decided we were going to talk about author voice. And I prepped for this interview a little bit by listening to Intuitive Editing. It's one of my favorite writing craft books. And I'm just going to, for fun, I'm going to hold up The Intuitive Author, which I haven't read yet because I'm waiting for the lovely audio by you to come out in order to enjoy that.
It's on its way.
Excellent.
We got about a third of the way into the recordings, and then it turned out that they were all unusable. So we're back to the drawing board and a little bit delayed, but we're getting there, yeah. The fun of the publishing industry.
That's even worse than getting through a third of a book, of writing a book and realizing it's unusable.
Honestly, it is so not. It's all I could think was I used to be an actor. Maybe that's another thing people don't know about me. And so I'm thinking of it as a rehearsal.
Oh.
Because I would rather take the lines that are already written and go back and redo them and keep working them than I would try to create the damn thing again. But I always joke, I am such an editor at heart, which is, if new listeners don't know me, that's what I do. I'm a professional editor. But I'm such an editor at heart. I love it more than I love the writing process. And I used to joke that I wished somebody would give me my first draft so that I could just edit it, because that's the fun part.
Well, it's good that you can look at this as sort of the audio equivalent of that.
What else are you going to do?
Yeah. Oh, well, I'll be looking forward anxiously to when that is all available, because I do love listening to you narrate your own books.
Thanks.
So we're going to be talking about author voice, and I think it makes sense to just start out, give us a little background so we all have a common understanding of when we're saying author voice, what do we mean?
Well, voice is kind of a really generalized term. And when people use it, I think they generally mean one of 3 things, which is author voice, which is kind of our aesthetic, our personality, our personal style that infuses itself in our writing. And then there's narrative voice, which is who is the ostensible narrator of your story, or what is the narrative tone? What is the narrative approach and style? And then there's character voice. And those can be the same thing. Like if you're doing a deep third or first person story, your character voice will be the narrative voice. And the author voice kind of is the giant umbrella under which they exist. But it should be fairly invisible and not interfere with that. In memoir, author voice, character voice, narrative voice, all the same thing. In, say, some like nonfiction, you might have a stronger narrative voice, but no character voice, and the author voice is just the aesthetic. So I think one of the reasons it's a tricky concept is partly because of that we might mean all these different things by it. But you and I were talking about author voice. So to me, it's the author's perspective and the way they communicate it. I really think it boils down to authenticity. How do you put the thing that makes you on the page? I think it's why we pick up books by the same authors over and over. It's why we gravitate to certain artists' work. And I mean visual artists, but I also mean singers, directors, even actors. You come to expect a certain feel from them that I think is a lot of the appeal for us. And it's certainly one of the big elements that can make your story stand out. Like if you're submitting to agents and publishers or you want to get readers' attention, voice, I think, is the thing that can set you apart from the pack and can draw somebody in almost based on that alone. One of the examples I always give, I don't know if you know Jenny Lawson. She goes by the Bloggess. She was one of the original bloggers like a million years ago. And she has the most distinctive, hilarious voice. One of her memoirs, I think it's called Let's Pretend This Never Happened. I always will do presentations on, effective first pages or creating character and stakes right away or whatever will create a hook for readers. And then I show them the first page of that book because there's really nothing happening. It basically breaks every rule of story. It's just one big, long kind of run-on stream of consciousness story that really doesn't have any bearing on whatever the overall story is about. And yet, every time I present it in a class, everybody falls out and falls in love with it because it is so rich with voice.
I think that the example of actors is a really interesting one because I think in a lot of cases, the sort of ultimate compliment to an actor is, well, they disappeared into the part. I forgot I was watching so-and-so. And yet there is this sense that the actor is bringing something like, they're bringing the actor equivalent of the author voice to that performance. And so is there a balance between being recognizable, having a recognizable voice while also sort of disappearing into your story the way an actor can sometimes disappear into a movie?
I think so. And if you think about different actors, there's a spectrum of that. I mean, there's actors like, I don't know, let's say Daniel Day-Lewis. Or, well, I was going to say Meryl Streep, but Meryl Streep always has a Meryl Streepness about her. And she does become all these different characters, but there's also something that's very uniquely her. But then you have other actors who are, a delight to watch, but might be kind of the same person every time. But that's their calling card.
Yeah.
That's the thing that we want to see from them. So I think there's a range of that. And I think it's the same with authors. It can depend on what story you're telling, what kind of story you're telling. It can depend on your genre. It can depend on where you are in what stage of your career. Sometimes I think it almost depends on mood and state of mind. I was writing a blog post this morning, and my blogs tend to be they have the same tone of my books, which is very intimate, conversational, chatty. Often there's a lot of humor. They can be kind of irreverent and casual. And I was trying to write one this morning for Thanksgiving, and that's just not where my head was at. So I kept trying to force it to be this voice that I feel like is me. And I finally thought, you know what? You and I were talking before the recording began. We're in kind of a weird headspace at the moment for various reasons, and that's okay. The thing is, if you're in touch with your authenticness, I think whatever is you comes through no matter what voice you're actually coming across as, if that makes sense. It's like a facet of your voice, and you may choose to reveal different facets at different times. But if you can stay in touch with that authenticity and the internality of it, like I think a lot of authors think of voice as something external that we have to try to find or put on in our work or just impose upon it, I guess. And I don't think that's what it is. I think voice is when you are accessing whatever's true to you internally and letting that come out, which is a lot scarier. It's a lot more naked because there's the chance that if you are your authentic self and people don't like it, it's really you that they're not liking. But I also think it's what we connect to. We were speaking of acting, there's a well-known saying in acting that you should never act with kids or animals. And it's because they're so authentic, they're riveting. So I feel like to shy away from that or to try to paste something over it that you think sounds like good writing or is something you've heard before, you're defaulting to some kind of flowery language or aphorism or cliched phrase that, maybe her stare is ice cold, but is there a way you can express that's more you or that more reflects your vision of what that is and what's happening in the story?
Yeah. Yeah, when we were talking about the actors who disappear, don't disappear into their parts, the person I always think of is Jack Nicholson as someone who, not taking away the fact that he's a great actor, but he always kind of seems like Jack Nicholson to me. I feel, true or false, I feel like I have a good idea of what Jack Nicholson would be like in person based on the performances he gives.
Or Christopher Walken, who's made a career out of, being Christopher Walken.
Yeah, it was like a brand.
It is brand. That's a great way to think of it.
Yeah. I remember reading that one of the reasons that Stephen King hated the movie The Shining is that the Jack Torrance character that Jack Nicholson played is supposed to be this totally normal, middle-of-the-road, nice-seeming guy at the beginning. And the horror is what happens to him when he goes to the Overlook. He becomes the monster he becomes. And he was like, look, it's Jack Nicholson. Like, we all know he's going to go crazy and, do weird things. And so I can't remember the name of the guy who played that character in the TV series, but it was much more like, he seems like a fine, upstanding guy until he gets to the Overlook, which was much more what Stephen King was going for. So it would be interesting to know if Jack Nicholson if he's doing that on purpose or it's just what he fell into, in the same way that an author might decide they're going to, capitalizing on that brand idea, it's the experience you want to give the reader more you showing through or you hiding behind your characters or being subsumed by the characters or something like that.
Yeah, that answer is probably different, I would imagine, for the most part, for actors than for authors. I think if your author voice, unless you're writing a memoir, I think if the author voice is taking over the story, you're probably not serving the story as well as you could. Unless the author voice, I don't know. That's a tough one. Yeah, where is the line with that? Because it's just a hard balance to find. The thing with author voice is I think I always say it's not something you create. You already have it. We all already have it. It's our personality. It's our background. It's our ethos and our worldview, the way we express ourselves. We all already have it. We just have to figure out what that is and how much of it to put on the page. And to your point, I think that's different for different stories. Like the voice that I have in my fiction is different from the voice of my nonfiction writing for authors because I sort of am present in the nonfiction writing. And I don't want to be present as the author in my fiction writing because I think that breaks that narrative dream.
Yeah.
But at the same time, so I write as Phoebe Fox in my fiction. And I and probably most authors want people to want to pick up my stories. If they like one, I want them to want more. And a big part of that is voice. What you're getting. Back in the day, I was a huge Pat Conroy fan, and I knew what I was getting when I picked up a Pat Conroy book. And that was the experience I wanted to have. Yes, the story itself, but also the way it was told, the feel of it, the way he used language, the lyricism of it. I didn't pick it up when I was looking for a really straightforward, kind of down and dirty Kent Harif type read. I was looking to have a bit more of a musical, lyrical experience. So I think that's part of why it's important that we know what ours is and let it infuse our writing.
Yeah, I think that this is so difficult to talk about because it's so difficult to recognize one's own voice. And I unfortunately thought of this just a few minutes before we hopped on here, or I would have experimented with it more. But I thought, what I'm going to do is follow up to this, and I'll report back in a future episode, is I'm going to take like a chapter of one of my books and I'm going to put it into ChatGPT, and I'm going to say, rewrite this in the style of Lee Child. Not rewrite this in the style of Pat Conroy. Now rewrite this in the style of somebody else. And I think it could be very informative to see what happens in those circumstances. And it would highlight the things that I don't see because it's my voice. So it's sort of invisible to me.
I actually did that recently in a presentation. Oh, yeah? Like literally I did exactly that. And
okay.
But, write this as Emily Dickinson, write it as a beat poet, write it as, Jack Kerouac. And I just picked a bunch of ways to show how that infuses the story. I think ChatGPT is a great way to do that, to see your own. One of the exercises I suggest in intuitive editing is actually doing that yourself also. Pick some of your favorite authors and take a passage. Well, you can do it one of two ways. You can take a neutral passage or a passage of another story and write it in their voice, or a passage of your story. Write it like them. Because I think that helps you understand what voice is. And just like it's easier to learn to analyze story objectively by starting with other people's, because you have that narrative distance that you don't have in your own, I think it can help to analyze other people's voice before you try to figure out what yours is. Like you said, what are the components of it? What makes you, if somebody handed you this and asked you, who's the author? If you could get anywhere close to it, like this is Victorian era, this is somebody, this is Bronte, this is Dickens, I don't know who this is, but I know what makes it that thing. What is it? Is it the formality of the language? Is it the phrasing? Is it the rhythm? Is it the personality of it? Is it the length of the sentences, the music of the sentences? Is it the word choice? Is it the setting? I mean, that's part of it, right? Certain authors are often going to set their stories in a similar. I just got really hooked on Octavia Butler, and she tends to set a lot of stories in kind of a similar feeling, dystopian, alternative fantasy type surrounding. So I think that's part of it. Then you could do it the other way around, and you could take one of their passages and put it in your voice. Like, what would change if you were the one telling this particular scene?
Yeah, I realized when you were talking about sort of characteristic settings, I realized that I very much gravitate toward places that are normally busy, but that are not for the purposes. So, for example, I set one of my books in Ocean City, Maryland, but in January. So, a place that would normally be bustling with summer tourists, or there's a mall near us that used to be the bustling mall, and now there's a wing has all been turned into doctor's offices, but the whole rest of the mall, I haven't been in the mall for, I don't know, a decade. But my husband had a need to go there recently, said, "Oh, you've got to go because it would be a great place." I just set a creepy scene because it's this environment where you expect there to be a lot of people. And it's just an echoing, deserted, big,
That's
creepy
interesting.
building.
I'm betting that maybe reflects some of the themes you like to write about, which is another aspect of voice. Like I am perpetually writing about family and forgiveness. Those are my themes. And it sounds like you're writing about what? Isolation?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think knowing trying to identify what is important to you too. Like not just what themes are important to you, but what's your worldview? What is it you feel your purpose is? Like, are you a helper? Are you someone who likes to shine a light on the truth? What is it that is your ethos?
Yeah, I think that also it's difficult. We were talking earlier about the idea of narrative voice and character voice and author voice as being three, different considerations. But I imagine that people can very intentionally pursue certain character voices, like say, I want to go through my manuscript and I want to make sure that my protagonist always sounds like the grumpy but faithful person that she is, or whatever that might be. And I'm wondering if is there a tension that authors face when they're trying to understand or support their own author voice along with understanding and supporting their character voices?
Well, I think one of the reasons, now that you've said it that way, that it can be hard to find our author voice is often when we're creating a character voice, we're doing that external to internal thing. This character sounds like so-and-so. They're gruff. What would you say? Gruff, and yet have a heart of gold, and whatever you decide your character sounds like. They're crusty, they're garrulous, they're difficult, they're contrary. But where do those things come from is the thing we have to do as authors to figure out not how necessarily they communicate, but why do they communicate the way they do. So if somebody is, let's say, soft-spoken, that's great if that's what you want to convey in there. They don't talk much, and when they do, they're kind of very reticent. You can convey that on the page, but you're going to have a much more faceted character if you can identify why they do that, because that's who that character is. And I think it's the same with us in author voice. We don't just want to go, gosh, I'd really like to write like, pick your poison, whoever it is you think is a brilliant writer and you want to be like them, but rather, what is it that I'm trying to communicate? Why do I want to say it the way I say it? And how is the way to say it that feels most truthful and authentic to me? But then the balance between that and character voice, I think, is that when the character is the one who's narrating, I think the author needs to pretty much get out of the way. But when the author is creating the character, there's kind of room for both to coexist. It really is a squishy thing to talk about. In one of my presentations, I draw Venn diagrams, and you've got author voice as this big kind of cloud that encircles everything else. And then to varying degrees, it intersects with character voice and with narrative voice. But it's both there and not there. Like I said, if it's drawing attention to too much to itself, you've pulled the reader out of the story. But you do want your sensibility to infuse the story the way that you would. It's the reason why we could give two authors the exact same premise and they wouldn't necessarily make the same thing out of it, not just the same story, but it wouldn't have the same feel. They wouldn't have the same approach. It certainly wouldn't be told in the same way, because we're all bringing to it the totality of our experiences and our perspective and who we are and what our personality is and how we would imagine something and the way we might react to something that we will infuse into our characters. That's not neutral for any of us. And that's another good exercise, actually. Try to write something that is totally neutral. And almost by default, you're going to start to see what your voice is, because it's really hard to be neutral because we're not. We are subjective, based on everything that we have been exposed to and learned and internalized in our lives.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting. It makes me think of, at the end of, when I'm done with every book, I have this list of things to check, like make sure I haven't accidentally spelled my character Louise's name Laos, which will get missed by the spell checkers, like all those kind of mechanical things. But one of the things I always do is check for how many times I have a character sigh, because sigh is my default thing. And then I had someone say, oh, mine is giggle. And I was like, giggle? I'm pretty sure that I have never used the word giggle.
Because it's not your personality. Same. I am not a giggler and I don't write giggle. Plus, it has a really specific connotation.
Yeah.
But I think it might be someone else's default word. And we all have them, we all have I think I did a search on one of my books and I must have said clearly like 45 times because it's one of my default words. And so there's two ways to think of that. One is when you're writing, you can be mindful of not defaulting to the easy choice, to the shortcut, I call it, and that's things that you've seen 1,000 times. She swallowed back bile, a tear ran down her cheek, the sighing, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
You can either try as you're writing that not to do it, but that can tend to sort of get me in my head and slow me down. So when I'm writing, I just go ahead and I use the shortcuts. I write the cliches, I use the rampant repetition of words. And then when I come back, I let myself really stop and think about, what am I actually seeing? What am I actually trying to convey? The example I gave of this in The Intuitive Author, my latest book, is I was writing a fan letter to an author, which I do a lot. Just, I don't know, because I would like to get one. I figure everybody would like to get one. And it was somebody I really liked. And I realized I was all caught up in trying to say it exactly right, exactly perfectly in a way that might catch their attention or impress them. And then I just stopped and thought, what is it I actually mean? What is it I want them to know about the experience I had with their story? Let me tell that thing, regardless of how it sounds, because that's going to sound like me, because I'm being truthful and authentic. And if you're being truthful and authentic to your character, to your story, it's going to sound like you in the context of how you are the de facto orchestrator of the story. And so your aesthetic is going to infuse it as long as you are finding that authenticity in the way you're telling it. Just get out of your own way, basically.
Yeah. Well, I think a really difficult thing, especially early on, but I just encountered this recently, is that I think there's real value in learning from the authors we admire while avoiding the temptation to try to imitate them. So the example that I ran into is that I was reading P.D. James. It's a very specific kind of style and content and so on. And then I was working on my own book, and I could tell, like, I had to really intentionally think, let's try not to pretend like we're P.D. James. Let's pretend that we're Matty Dalrymple. So what would your advice be in terms of hitting that balance between, like, the good kind of emulation and the bad kind of emulation?
Well, if you're a mimic, and I think a lot of us can tend to be, just not on purpose, we just internalize it. And I think we are in touch with that music of what voice is, and it kind of infuses itself into us. Then stay away from that when you're writing something that you think the temptation would be strong. I went through a long phase where I had to, like I said, there was a time when I was a huge Pat Conroy fan. I had to not read him while I was writing, because otherwise I was writing Pat Conroy.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to be that thing. So that's one solution, is just cut it out. I know authors who won't read in their genre when they are writing, when they're actively writing. Now that's tricky, because if you're a working author, you're always actively writing, and you always want to be reading in your genre because you want to know what's out there. So that's an extreme solution. But I think we have our favorites. You don't have to necessarily read that. But I think the solution ultimately is just that authenticity. If you are shortcutting to what you've heard or what you like the sound of or something you're trying to be, that's what's going to make you sound like other people. It's staying in touch with your vision and your perspective and your sensibility and your aesthetic that's going to keep you in your own head. It all sounds really amorphous, and it is. Voice is one of the hardest things to talk about. It's one of the hardest things to teach. And it's ironic because, like, all the other elements of story truly are things I think we have to learn. You're not born knowing how to create a character. You're born knowing how to be one. But you have to learn how to understand how to put that on the page, or any other element of story. But voice, you totally have that already. You don't have to understand what it is. You don't even necessarily have to define what it is, although it can be helpful. But you do have to know how to access and free that thing. And I have a bunch of different exercises that can help you do that. We talked about some of the writing, like one of my English teachers used to have us write parodies. Not have us. She used to allow me to write parodies. Like, we had to do a book report on The Heart of Darkness, Joseph Conrad. And I wanted to write a parody of it called The Heart of Decula, which was a small town near where I lived. And she's like, okay, because she said it was an AP class. Like, this was not a phoning it in. This was for AP grades. And she said, you can't parody something unless you truly understand it. So if you look at parodies or impressions that people do of other people, you have to understand what makes that unique and individual to that artist, that person, to be able to mimic it. So it can actually be a really valuable exercise. Another one can be to ask your friends this can potentially open up a can of worms, characterize the way you communicate. Like, I know that I speak in ridiculous $10 words when none are necessary. I know that I can have like I speak in tree branches sometimes. So I have appositives and my thoughts go off in em dashes and, parentheticals. But eventually I'll always get back to the trunk. But that's just how I communicate. I am as likely to mix highbrow language with, tween slang as I am to use any other words. All of that becomes part of my, it's not always flattering necessarily to hear that, because you would like to think that the way you communicate is just straightforward and easy to understand. But we all, and hopefully it is, but we all have our little quirks, and those quirks are part of our voice. It's why you can tell, like when you're hearing, one of my favorite games to play with music is who's singing that, because it's not so much just the tenor of their voice, it's their phrase. Watch Jamie Foxx do impressions of like John Legend or any other singer. Watch Ariana Grande do impressions of Britney Spears or Celine Dion. It's not that she suddenly sounds like their actual voice, but she understands their mannerisms, their phrasings, their rhythms, the way they shape words. That's all part of the voice. And that's the equivalent we want to find for ourselves as authors. What is the thing that we do that makes it uniquely ours and distinctive and reflect who we really are?
Yeah, this isn't a good example of reflecting who we really are, but those examples remind me of, and this sounds so familiar to me, maybe we've talked about this before, but Flight of the Conchords. Have we ever talked about Flight of the Conchords?
And, no, but I have friends who love it.
Yeah, so it's about these two guys from New Zealand who are in like New York or something, I forget. And there's always like a musical number. And they are brilliant musicians because they've done spot on like rap parodies. They have one that's sort of like a 1970s French, like they're all riding around on bicycles and speaking like weird French. And I can't even remember all of them, but I thought that is like the sign of a brilliant musician when you can execute on those completely different styles, and
because you understand them. It's the same thing as writing parody that my English teacher said.
Yeah. So some of what you were saying about like using the $10 words and so on, we talked a little bit earlier about a voice in nonfiction as well. And it feels easier to me because I think that people expect the voice of the writer and the voice they're reading on the page. Like there is no character as much as there is in fiction. If somebody read a book, like they listened to this podcast episode and then they read your book and your book was very, short little sentences and, boiled down to its
formal, very formal. And
very formal, then they would be disappointed. So do you think that there's a different perspective that nonfiction authors need to bring to the idea of voice?
I think it depends what kind of nonfiction you're writing. If you're writing, a treatise on the economy, then chances are it might be a little bit, I'm going to say dry, and I mean dry in the sense of not necessarily infused with a lot of personality and voice. But then you look at stuff that is, like Malcolm Gladwell wrote, Freakonomics? Mm-hmm. That kind of was a book about the economy, or certainly about how a lot of things in the world work. And I think one of the things that made it such a huge bestseller was it was full of voice. It did have that sensibility and aesthetic that made it a little more, I think, accessible, less dry, if you will. But that's not going to wash in an academic setting necessarily. So I think it depends what you're doing. And when I'm writing my nonfiction, the way I always think of it, I said in Intuitive Author, is my aesthetic is come into the living room here and sit down and let's talk about writing. And I want it to sound like that. I want it to be intimate and connected and real, the way you and I are talking right now, the way I would talk to any author if we were sitting down. So that's important to me. But I also have, like you probably do, a mess of craft books up here. Not all of them take that approach, and that's okay. Because it's different for every reader too. Not every reader wants that kind of, I guess, more casual, intimate approach. They may do better with a more structured or formal or like traditionally narrative academic feeling approach. So I think you don't want to try to appeal to all readers. You just have to do what's true for you, what kind of book you want to write, and then find the audience for that, find the market for that. And that may depend on what is marketable, because you may want to write a really accessible, laid-back book about I don't know, think of the driest sentence you can think of. And there may be no market for that at all because the audience is serious academics who want to use it to cite the study for their own ongoing research or whatever. So that's not going to be taken very seriously. I think you have to consider your target audience.
Well, I think that the idea of the group of craft books is a perfect one because I'm very much a person who is, I like to have a few things and go deep. Like, I don't like to sample a lot of things. I like to find my sources and then like reread them over and over and really study them carefully. And I think for a lot of nonfiction, writing craft books is the perfect example. It's not like there are going to be that many circumstances where someone says, show, don't tell. I never heard that one before. Like, a lot of the advice is going to be the same. It's how the person expresses it. Like, it's your voice there that is going to win you fans or not win you fans.
Or help the light bulb go off. You know, like you said, you may have to read something 14 different ways to understand it, or you may have to really dig deep in the one way that does speak to you. But it's the same thing with story. Nobody's telling any totally original story.
Right.
You know, nothing's new under the sun. What makes it stand out is the way that you're telling it. And one component of that is voice.
You had mentioned the idea of the marketability, and I'm wondering is there ever a circumstance with your clients, for example, where the advice you give them is that their voice isn't appropriate? Like, I don't know. I can't even come up with a good example. Like, someone claims they're writing noir, but it's much too sunny feeling, or the opposite. You know,
or it's not appropriate for the scene. Even
it's not appropriate for the scene. Yeah. So do you have any advice or do you ever give the advice where someone actually needs to work on changing their voice?
So as an editor, I feel like my job is not to change anyone's voice. And I tend to do very little actual like line editing in the sense of going through and crossing out words and rephrasing things, because that is the author's sensibility and it's their prerogative. And that's not my job to come in and try to, impress my own view of what that should be. So I tend to take a pretty hands-off view of that. The one time I will talk about it is if it's a genre mismatch, as you said. Like, I'm working on one now that has a fairly deep storyline about a character with a terminal illness. And then there's also a romance element. And there's a scene where those two kind of butt up against each other in a way that did feel jarring to me. I think it detracted from the seriousness of the illness storyline, and it kind of equated it in importance with what was happening in the romance storyline. That's not to say that it's not. You know, the illness is another character, and this character's romance, of course, is important to them. But I think we want to be careful with the tonal match of what we're talking about with how we're talking about it. So in that case, I would address it big picture. But I think editors do authors a disservice if they go in and try to make their voice correct or homogenize it or put their own vision on it. If anything, our job is to help the author access their own voice. So rather than changing something that felt, let's say it feels trite or overfamiliar or cliched, instead of crossing it out or changing it to something, I might say, this feels like, overfamiliar is my nice way of always saying it feels a little cliched or stereotyped. So I'll say this feels a little overfamiliar. What does this actually mean to you that she's saying this? Or what is her mindset right now? Or what is she actually seeing? So we're trying to put ourselves in the character voice, but the author creates the character. So the author voice will also infuse that. Your, let's say, angry, jealous, jilted boyfriend is going to react differently than mine, not only based on the story that you've put them in and the character you've created, but in your sensibility, your imagination, the way you see it. So I would just ask questions to try to help the author maybe find more authentic ways of conveying something. I've said it a minute ago, but a couple of the things I see all the time that always kind of put the hair on the back of my neck up is things like she swallowed back bile, or, sparkling eyes, or, see the single tear running down her cheek or whatever. These are things we've seen 1,000 times, And I get what you're trying to convey, but can you find a more authentic way to actually convey that thing that's what you see or how you would describe that? And can you, rather than even defaulting to a description that's external like that, can you even dig deeper than that? Speaking of finding voice and authenticity, and instead of describing the effect of it, the tear or the bile, which nobody really swallows back bile, you guys, but instead of, that's the effect of whatever's happening inside that character. If you can access what's happening inside them and let us feel that directly and firsthand, that's always going to feel more intimate and immediate and authentic than whatever pretty phrase you can think of to describe how it manifests.
Yeah, I'm realizing based on this conversation that an example for me would be when I look at my reviews, oftentimes one of the things people call out that they like about my books is they're not humorous books by any means, but there are scenes that are humorous, regardless of the fact that none of the characters seen would think they were humorous. But like stepping back and looking down on it, you can see the humor of the situation. And I think that's an example for me of that distinction between the author voice and the character, the narrative voice. There's
I'm betting that's a big part of who you are. Knowing you, and you and I know each other at this point decently well, you are a person who generally tends to see you're a lighter spirited person for the most part. You do tend to see the humor in things, and that does infuse itself in your writing. I have the hardest time trying to write anything without humor in it because I'm the same way. Yeah. And that does become a part of your voice and part of what your readers love about your stories and come to expect. When they're picking up a Matty Dalrymple book, that's what they want.
Yeah. Cool. Well, Tiffany, as always, it is lovely, lovely to speak with you. And please let everyone know where they can go to find out more about you and everything you do online.
The best place is foxprinteditorial.com. It's my website, and that has all of my free resources. There's a lot of them, downloadables, a weekly blog, a bunch of references and resources. You can find my online classes there. If you want to find me on socials, they're there, but I'm a very erratic user of social media because that's not fully authentic to my voice. So it's probably the best place to go.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matty.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Tiffany. What techniques have you found most effective in discovering and expressing your authentic voice in your writing? I would love to hear your thoughts. Just leave a comment on YouTube. And if you got value from this episode and were thinking, I wish I could buy Matty a cup of coffee, you could do that. Scroll to the bottom of any page at INDYAUTHOR.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. Until next time, here's wishing you favorable winds and smooth sailing on your creative voyage.